Socialism and capitalism, if you learned anything from the lesson I gave on Monday night, it's not a 0-1, it's not an either or, it's a continuum. And that's why we have the Economic Freedom of the World Index to measure where countries sort of place on a continuum. On the one end, we've got more capitalism, on the other end, we've got more socialism, but every country has elements of capitalism and elements of socialism within it. That was true of the Soviet Union. There were markets in the Soviet Union, not a lot, and they weren't very free markets, but they existed. And the United States and Hong Kong, which are more capitalist, we have elements of socialism in. We have public education, which in the United States, government schools, that's a socialist type of institution. So it's not a 0-1. But what I want to talk about now or today is the sort of far extreme end of that spectrum, the socialist end of the spectrum, and talk about countries, not so much today, but countries in history, although at least one or two cases, countries today, that have gone down the path very far towards the socialist spectrum. And unlike Monday night, there are precisely 0 numbers in this talk. All I have is pictures and stories. So it's a very different talk. And the reason for it being different in part is because I've spent my career doing numbers. What I did Monday night is my bread and butter, my norm. It's what I do. I wake up in the morning and I think about those graphs and I run regressions. That has been my life for 40 years in this profession. But about, 8 years ago, my friend Ben Powell, he runs the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. Texas Tech is also in Texas, like my university, although it's about a 5 or 6 hour car drive away. We usually fly to see each other inside of our own state because it's too far to drive most of the time. And he, like me, has written a lot of articles and books that very few people have ever read. And we are both running institutes. We're well paid. We're full professors. We have accomplished a lot of our career goals. So he had the idea, hey, how about we travel around, because we like to travel together. Usually we would travel together to climb mountains. We were big mountain climbers when I was younger together. And I've kind of aged out of that. But we also like to drink too much. I'm not necessarily proud of that, but that's just a simple statement of fact. We drink too much. So we decided to travel around and drink too much, and maybe because we wanted to write it off our taxes, we should write a book, because if we write it off as a book, this all becomes a big business expense. Okay, so that's where this started. Right about the time we had this idea to write a book and travel and drink, socialism got hot, like the topic. All of a sudden, socialism became a really big thing. In the United States, Bernie Sanders, who called himself a socialist, although he would frequently modify it by saying, I'm a democratic socialist. We'll talk about that. But Bernie Sanders, who was a U.S. senator and a credible candidate for president of the United States, called himself a socialist. AOC, the congresswoman, she called herself a socialist. So we had a moment there. So we decided, all right, we're going to go drink around and travel. Let's go to socialist countries, either currently or former socialist, or maybe countries that want to be socialist in the future, and see if 2 economists can make some observations about it. Now, the book we ended up writing was a popular audience book, so this is the least technical. Some of you wanted more technical. This is the least technical talk probably in the entire program. But we decided to see if we could do some man-on-the-street stories. And our inspiration for this, at least my inspiration, was Anthony Bourdain. Do you remember Anthony Bourdain, the food, former chef, food writer, travel blogger on what was Travel Channel or CNN. He did all these things. A great man. He died too young. But he would travel. He was very irreverent. He drank too much too, and smoked too much. I don't smoke, but he drank and smoked too much. And I like that, you know. And he was very irreverent. He would just say what came to his mind. All right. So Ben and I decided to try to do an Anthony Bourdain style book, but about economics and socialism. All right. So the title of this talk is "The Realities of Socialism." Spoiler alert. Don't look at the next slide if you don't want to know how it ends. But I'll go ahead. So close your eyes. No. To give away the ending, socialism, for lack of a better word, sucks. And we titled the book that. I can't believe they let us do this. But they said, that sounds great. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. And then the subtitle of the book is Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. Now, the reason for the drinking, in part, is because Ben and I were going to do an honest portrayal of our travels. And if I'm traveling with Ben, there's going to be alcohol involved. And we wanted the book to be an honest reflection of what we actually were doing. But it turns out, and this was unintentional, but it was very beneficial, alcohol, beer in particular, but not just beer, became a very useful metaphor that we could use to describe the operation of these different economies that we were visiting. So we're going to use beer as a little bit of a metaphor. But it's not just a metaphor. It was quite literal. We actually did drink a lot of beer. But it also became a useful way for us to have a conversation about what was going on. And this is also more microeconomic. Socialism and capitalism is macroeconomic. It's about the entire economy. But what this travel log book did is it allowed Ben and me to get on the street and see what are the sort of microeconomic, day-to-day, literally at a street level, what are the implications of socialism? What does it mean? What does it look like? What do the people do all day? Those kinds of things. So let's get at it. I should mention, this is the moment, right? This is dated January 16. It's 2016, January 31st, New Year's Eve. And Michael Moore, he's a esteemed intellectual academic. You may see polls like this, right? I'm sure if you did polls in Israel, you might see similar results. We were getting numbers like 60% of young people, when they fill out these survey opinion polls, say that they had a favorable view of socialism. Now, I was like, wow, 60%? What's wrong with these kids? So again, this was the moment. We're like, all right, everyone's talking about socialism. Michael Moore is tweeting about it. Bernie Sanders is calling himself a socialist, and people are actually voting for him to be president of the United States. So let's go. All right. So that's what we did. In terms of where we went to these countries, sort of, maybe. We went to Sweden, Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, the country, and we ended up back in the USSA. And do you know what that references? The Beatles. Thank God. I gave this talk to a bunch of American students, and they had no idea that was a play on the old Beatles song. So good for you. Have some proper music history in your background. But yes, yeah. So each chapter, except for the last one, each chapter more or less is something about socialism with a modifier. So let's talk about Sweden first. And the title of that chapter is not socialism, because it's not socialism. If you remember the Economic Freedom Index talk on Monday night, the Nordic countries, Denmark was in the top 10, Sweden was like 30th, Finland, Norway are in the 30s, Iceland's 27 or something, I forget number, but none of them they're all on the blue side of that spectrum on that map that we showed. They have high taxes and big governments in a fiscal sense, but for the most part, they have private property, there's not a central plan, they allow free trade, they're relatively, except for labor markets, they're relatively lightly regulated compared to, say, even like the United States. And so we have this, that's, in fact, you know how you know Sweden isn't socialist? The beer is great. That's how you know. So that's us drinking, actually it's not even Swedish beer, we're drinking Belgian beer, Duval Cafe in the streets of Stockholm. I don't know who owns that bar, but it's not the government of Sweden. Some guy named Sven probably owns that bar. That's his place of business. And he goes home and lives in a private home, apartment or building, a home. He drives a private car. Do the Swedish government tell him what beers to stock or how much to charge? No. They tax him. We've covered that. But there's no central plan. There's no day-to-day interference in his business for the most part. I'm sure they have the normal things, which, as a libertarian maybe annoy me. Like, I'm sure he has an occasional health inspection or an occasional this or that. But mostly he's free to operate his business however he wants. And that would be true of most Swedes. It's not a socialist economy. It's a market economy with high taxes, all right, with unusually high taxes, but nevertheless a market economy. So we had to get that out of the way. When we wrote the book anyway, Sweden was 27th most free. I think today they're like 36 or something, but it's still, they're blue, they're not red or even yellow. They're way up the scale in economic freedom. So we're not talking about Sweden. That's a conversation that is important. How high should taxes go? Does Sweden lose something because it has raised its taxes so much? I think they have. Just as a data point, Sweden in 1960 was the second richest country in Europe. And now I think it's 22nd or something. I think they have paid a price for their high taxes. But it's not socialism. It's just high taxes. It's a different thing. So we wanted to talk about real socialism, not the Nordic thing. So, all right, let's move on and talk mostly about socialism. I'm going to start with Venezuela. The title of this is Starving Socialism, and it's almost quite literal. Over the last decade, the average Venezuelan has lost about, I'm trying to do math here, something around 10 or 12 kilos, 15 to 20 pounds, maybe a little higher than that. And they're not doing so voluntarily. A lot of Americans especially could stand to lose 20 pounds, but they're losing it involuntarily. The country is quite literally not able to provide enough calories to sustain the body weight of the population. The population is actually across the board losing weight. They're struggling to provide the basic necessities like food. And we didn't go into Venezuela. We forgot to get visas because, I don't know, we're just lazy. And, but we went to Cucuta, Colombia. It's on the border. It's on the western border of Venezuela, the eastern border of Colombia. And it's a major city on the Colombian side. And then there are bridges, 2 bridges that you can cross, pedestrian bridges only. They don't allow cars to travel across. If the Venezuelans let cars leave, they would never come back. They were going to keep on driving. So people would walk across these bridges, and without exaggeration, tens of thousands of people a day. It's like Disneyland. I mean, just streaming numbers of people all day long coming across the bridge, carrying suitcases. You can see some people with suitcases, perhaps. I'm a terrible photographer. I'm sorry. We were drinking. So they're carrying bags, and the bags are heavy on the way in because what's in the bags on the way into Colombia from Venezuela? Cash, money. Because at that time, Ben's got a stack of bolivares, $100 bolivar notes. It was the largest denomination note they had. That's about 20 US dollars, right there. So $100 would be this. If you wanted to buy a car, you would need the equivalent of a car's worth of cash to buy that. So they were bringing in literally suitcases of worthless Venezuelan currency. They would find a dealer who gives them a terrible exchange rate on the street, and they would trade that for just a tiny few Colombian pesos. And then they would go to stores, and they would buy rice and beans and sugar, diapers, shampoo, aspirin. They were going grocery shopping. We talked to a couple, and we had I have decent Spanish, but not really good enough to converse and do an interview. So we had a friend, and we met this one couple, Paulo and Ana Maria. They had driven 3 days, one way, from a town called Ciudad Bolivar. It's on the other side of Venezuela, near the sort of Guyana or the Brazilian border, way on the other side of the country. They drove all the way across the country to come to Colombia. They parked their car, they walked across, and they were middle-class people. You could tell by their dress they weren't super rich looking, but they clearly were not peasants. You saw some poor people here, but you saw mostly kind of normal people. And they had driven 3 days, so it's going to be a 6-day round trip. Now, I'm having trouble because I'm in Israel. Because you can't drive to Cairo or Damascus. So it's really hard. But what would, so in my case, if I'm in Dallas, I say, what would it take for me? How bad would my life in Dallas have to be for me to get in my car and drive to Vancouver, Canada to go? That's a 3-day trip. That's a 2-day trip. So I got to go further. I got to go to, how far do I got to go to New York City to buy food, just to go grocery shopping. and turn around and do it again. By the way, the roads are dangerous. Paulo said he couldn't drive at night. They have to park and make sure there's someplace safe at night because there are too many banditos on the road at night. And this was shocking because these were not peasants. Peasants frequently do crazy things to stay alive, right? When you're really, really poor, you do what it takes to stay alive. But once you get to be middle class or upper class, it's actually not normal to drive 3 days to go grocery shopping. And this was what, without exaggeration, thousands of people were doing every day. They're still doing it every day as I speak. It was really quite something. Now, I want to talk about democratic socialism a little bit. Because I think there's 41 countries, according to somebody made a list, there were 41 countries that went hard Marxist socialist. Soviet Union, Poland, Cambodia, Vietnam, you can add them up. 41. Of the 41, how many of them elected their socialist government? One. It's Venezuela. All right. Castro wasn't elected. All right. Lenin and Stalin sure as hell weren't elected, right? Hugo Chavez was elected in by all accounts, a fair election. He won. All right, he took the country in a socialist direction. So first of all, if the democratic socialism, can you combine democracy, a liberal, open, democratic system, which allows you freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and all the things that go with that? Can you combine that with an economic system where the government's in charge of economics? Well, the answer is we don't really know because it's hardly ever been tried. Like most places that have done the hard economics, they never even tried the Democratic Party. It was just socialist, right? They tried. How is that democracy in Venezuela today? Have you paid attention?
It doesn't exist.
No, the last election was unambiguously, all observers agree the last election was a completely stolen, fraudulent election. Maduro, Chavez's successor, stole the election. Everybody knows the opposition won the election. Hundreds of thousands of people hit the streets to protest. Tens of thousands of people got arrested. Maduro is still the president, and it's no longer a democracy. If you look at democracy scores like the ones provided by Freedom House, they had a pretty good score, and now they got a really bad score because the democracy's gone. So this was for a while the shining example of democratic socialism. Chavez was elected. They're socialists. Wonderful. Well, now again, it's just socialist now. It's not, the democratic part's gone. So this is a little bit of a conversation that takes us to that Friedman and Hayek stuff we were talking about earlier. The basic position that Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek had was that democratic socialism is an oxymoron, that you cannot combine those two things well, or at least not for very long. Venezuela did it for a while, but it didn't really last much more than a decade before it all fell apart. There's some reasons for that, but let's talk about beer a little bit. There is beer in Venezuela. It's not terrible. Polar is the largest company that makes beer. It is still nominally private. They haven't nationalized it, but one thing that Polar has to do is they have to buy barley. Barley is a kind of a cold weather crop. In fact, even in the United States, most of the barley we get either comes from the northern United States or Canada for making our beer or whiskey. And so barley has to be imported. Well, what do you think the Canadians and the American farmers who grow barley expect to get paid in? Venezuelan bolivares? No. They expect to be paid in dollars or Canadian dollars or US dollars. And the government's in control of the foreign exchange system and completely. So the only way for Polar to do its business, to actually conduct making and selling beer, is if the government allots to them enough dollars. And they frequently just don't have enough dollars, so they don't. And so Polar, on a repeated basis, has to shut their factories down. There are minor on and off again beer shortages in Venezuela as a result. Beer was generally available in Cucuta because we were getting it you're on the border with Colombia, so you all had all this Colombian beer too. But we did find Polar. That's Venezuela. It's the one current example of a sort of left Marxian-inspired socialist country that's still surviving. We'll talk about North Korea in a bit, but the next place on our stop is Cuba. We went to Cuba in 2018, so some of this conversation is a little different if I was talking about a trip today. But in Cuba, when you get there, first of all, no one's starving. No one's losing weight. There's food. I almost said plenty of food, but that's not exactly right. There's food. The country is subsisting. They're getting by. And it's not unpleasant. It's a Caribbean island. It's a nice place to be. The sun is bright, the breeze is nice, and so forth. We stayed in first night we stayed in a hotel. It was a government-run hotel called Hotel Trinton, somewhat famous. It's in the outskirts of Havana. There are really fancy hotels. The government puts a lot of money in, but I didn't want to stay in that. I wanted to stay in a normal hotel, just a regular place. So we stayed at Hotel Trinton, and it was bad. Let's see, how bad? There's mold on the ceiling tiles. There were holes in the towels. I pulled a cup. When you go to a hotel, sometimes they have the glasses or the cups in a little plastic bag, and it said sanitized on it. And I pulled the cup out, and let's just say it wasn't sanitized. The one hotel. We stayed at two government hotels. The one had this toilet seat, the bolt that holds the seat. One of them was gone. So when you sat on it, it had a tendency to kind of. And when you sit in it after a night of drinking, you kind of just, But there was really good news. There was soap available, although it was soap left over from the previous guest. Right? So, to say that these hotels are bad they were bad. Really bad. I've stayed in bad hotels in this world before. These were really bad. And the question is, why are the hotels so bad? Are they idiots in Cuba? Do they not know how to run hotels? Of course they know how to run hotels, but that hotel is owned by the government. What happens if the hotel does a poor job and loses money? People like me go around telling people like you about how never stay at the Hotel Trinton. I'm like, it's a terrible. They get the worst Yelp reviews. There's no Yelp in Cuba, but if they had Yelp, they would get bad reviews, or Travel Visitor, or Travelocity, or whatever.
They have more money.
Well,
Nothing happens.
nothing happens. They're not going to go out of business. It's a government enterprise. They're just going to stay in business. No one has any incentive to make that place better. So it was pretty terrible. There was a really nice contrast. Right around 2000, I want to say 10 to 12, somewhere in that period, they did two big liberalizations in Cuba. They decided to move away from socialism a little bit in two areas. One was housing. They let people rent out their houses. Now, to be clear, no one in Cuba owns their house. It's a socialist country. All housing is owned by the people, the government. Okay? But you have a permission, you have a piece of paper. It's got your name on it and the address, and it says, okay, this is your residency permit. And what the government now allows you, if you have a residency permit for a particular apartment or home, you can rent it out to other people. Sometimes it's just a room. I think that was the intention, really. It would just be a room, like a side room or something you could rent out to a visitor. But now people are renting out their entire places, and they just move in with their relatives or something because they're trying to make money. It's like a big Airbnb operation. And they're great. It's got butter, soap, in packages, nice. They had water. Not hot water. They had water because for 24 hours, Hotel Trinton had no water. Not just hot water, there was no water. So they were quite nice, about $50 a night. For what you got, it was worth $50 in any context. Decent place. Air conditioning. Hotel Trinton had air conditioning, sort of. But the ones we stayed at, these people have invested. And what happens if you stay in one of these places, they're called casas particulares in the language. If you stay at one of these casas, and you can actually give them a bad review on Airbnb, because many of them are listed on Airbnb. Even though Cuba doesn't have much of an internet, relatives in Miami will list their properties from Miami, and then they just you pay the Miami relatives the money, and then you arrive in Cuba, and they Western Union, or they work out the exchange somehow. So anyway, so there's a real contrast then. You can see visually on the street the difference between the quality and the care being taken of at the government hotels versus the casas. We stayed in multiple days. We stayed in each. We wanted to sort of see that difference. It's also true in the restaurants. Same story in the restaurants. The restaurant quality was much better in the private ones than the public ones, because we would ask, because you could just ask them, like, is this a private or public? And Yeah, they tell you, no, this is, gobierno, government. But there were private ones, and some of them are really nice. The food was about the same at both, though. And why would that be? Yeah, the government still owns the supply. Now, there's a lot of smuggling going on, and both the private and the public were undoubtedly used smuggling to help get improved supplies. But one thing that was really evident is the lack of salt. It's an island, and they're surrounded by salty water, but they don't have salt. People make their own salt by literally old-fashioned way. Put some seawater in a bucket and let the water evaporate. That's not really tasty salt, though, when you get right down to it. But the government just doesn't want to buy salt from abroad. You can buy salt. It's not a very expensive product, but the government just doesn't want to spend its scarce dollars on salt. And in fact, Castro gave a speech once because people complained, like, we would like to have salt on our food. It makes it taste a lot better. You don't know how bad food is without salt until you've tried it. Trust me, it's terrible. But Castro gave a whole, one of his famous 3-hour speeches as a rant about how salt was bourgeois. It's salt, man. It's not bourgeois, but okay. So my advice to you, if you go to Cuba, is to bring salt. Bring your own. Or I brought Tabasco. And Tabasco is primarily salt, so it was just a quicker, easier way. Anyway, those are the sanitized, the bathroom, the soap. Those are the nice rooms. I want to picture telling. 2 things. The top picture on the left, that's a pedestrian street in central Havana, not the touristy Havana Vieja, which is the old city where the tourists go. That's where they drop off the Canadian cruise ship people, and they go to the old city, and they look at the old, cool colonial part. We went to the working part. All right, Central, Habana Central. And that many of those streets are just closed to, they don't have cars. What's weird about that street? If that was Tel Aviv, a working street in Tel Aviv versus a working street in Havana, Cuba, what's weird about that street? Anybody see anything a little bit off?
It's empty, there's no sidewalks.
So that's because it's a pedestrian. You can walk anywhere you want. Yeah, there's not a lot of people. The thing I'm looking for is, if Ben and I were looking for beer, how would we know there was beer down there in Tel Aviv? There's no signs. Absolute lack of signage, advertising. They had socialist placards everywhere, but there were no, I want to know where the bars are. Now, in every country I've been in, including the poor countries, the poorest of the poor countries, they have enough wherewithal to put a sign sticking out from the building so I could see it from a block away. There's a bar. And the beer companies are the ones that give the bars these signs because they want them to go buy their beer there. So you would be standing there on a street and you're like, I don't know if this is just going to be a row of residences, like homes for people, or if there's going to be businesses. You had to be walking, and then you'd have to be right on top of the place of business and have to look in and see what was there. Sometimes it was a bar, and there'd be lively music, and other places it'd be like a little store, but you didn't know until you got there, which was very strange. It makes it really hard to navigate without signage. Until you've done it, this is the weirdness of socialism, right? It's not that Cubans are poor, that they don't have signs, right? They're poor in Nigeria, and I guarantee you they have signs in Nigeria, right? It's because it's socialist. Like what happens when you walk into a store, in a socialist store? The worker's like, geez, I gotta work. All right, nothing good. That's just trouble, right? So normal places, someone comes in their place, they're like, hey, come on in, I got a seat for you right here, right? So that's weird. No signs. It made it hard to walk around and figure out where to go. Another thing that's weird on the top right. Now I took that photo because it was well stocked. This was in Havana, also, Central Havana, and it's like a little 7-Eleven, a little tienda, a little store, and it was well stocked. It got a lot of. You can see there's stuff on the shelves. If you look closely at that picture, anything weird about that picture? Yeah, there's not really any signs. There's no signs that says the store. It doesn't say. Yeah, they had prices. They were like the old-fashioned kind that were like the little label. Not in that store. They don't have vegetables in my 7-Eleven either, so.
There's no entrance. You buy from the outside.
No. How many items are in there? How many distinct items? Okay, there's one kind of cola. Cuba has one kind of cola. It's called Coca-Cola. Ben called it Kami Cola. And there's one kind of toothpaste. And there's about 20 items distinctly. Now, there's a lot of them. To their credit, there's actually a whole stack of that Coca-Cola, a whole stack of the toothpaste, and a whole stack. There's plenty of it, but you're going to get whatever the government decided to make it, comrade, and that's it. If you wanted a different kind of cola, it's tough. Beer, they have two kinds. So, wow, that's like twice as good. They have two kinds. They've got a beer called Cristal and a beer called Bucanero. Bucanero was like a dark lager. The other one was like a light lager. They were both not very good, but we drank a lot of it. After a few days, though, we've gotten spoiled. If you're a beer drinker, you know what I mean. There are so many great beers in the world now. These microbreweries and all this stuff. And after a week in Cuba with only two kinds of beers available, we were like, man, I really would like, I drank a Heineken once because somebody had smuggled Heineken in or something. And I'm like, all right, I hate Heineken. It's gross. But I am just desperate for anything that isn't a Cristal or a Bucanero. So that was, again, where beer became a metaphor, right? Or an instruction. The socialist economy of Cuba makes beer. But who decided what beer to make? Well, the central planners in some building in the bureaucracy. And they decided they were going to make a light one and a dark one. And they, to their credit, they are making it. It was widely available. Never found a place where it was sold out. I found things that were sold out, like meat counters with no meat and things like that. But there were plenty of beer. But again, two kinds. So the utter lack of variety. Bernie Sanders famously said once, who needs 50 kinds of deodorant? And because you go to I'm sure you go to an Israeli store, an American store, you see just, just this entire array of deodorant or toothpaste or whatever. And it's like, who needs 50? I only use one kind. That's it. I don't know about you. I buy the same kind pretty much every time. But there's 50 people here in this room almost, right? And I'm guessing that you don't use what I use, right? And so Bernie Sanders was quite okay. He was using that as an example of the excesses of capitalism. Capitalism is wasteful. It spends all this money, all this marketing. Why do we need so many kinds of deodorant? Like, well, I don't know. We got a lot of different kinds of people. Maybe that's a good reason to have a lot of kinds of deodorant. So anyway, Cuba that was pretty cool. I got to talk about the cars because I'm a car guy. Who was I talking to at lunch? I've got 6 cars. I love telling Europeans I have 6 cars. Their eyes go crazy. Like, what? And then I tell them how many guns I have, and then they really get crazy. I like cars. I've got old cars. I got new cars. I like cars. I'm a car guy. Ben's a bit of a car guy, too. He's got an old Corvette, 75 Corvette. So when you first get there, in the background, you see that's a 1957 Chevy, if I've got it right. And when you first get there, a car guy like me, I'm like, oh, this is cool, because they don't have any cars in Cuba that are new, really. They have some. But we're very famous for having these old 50s cars. And I'm like, oh, it's really neat. Here's the problem. That 50s Chevy in the background there is a piece of junk. The engine blew up 2 decades ago. It's got a John Deere tractor engine in there. The suspension is being held together with bubble gum and rubber bands. And don't even ask about air conditioning. We took several taxi rides in these old classic 56 Plymouth, 57. It was cool for about 30 seconds, and then you're like, I want to get out of this thing. It's terrible. What's the value of that car in America? Now, I don't know about Israel, but being a car guy, I kind of have a sense. A 57 Chevy, which is like the most premier Chevy. That's the one everybody wants, is a 57. But in that condition, without a proper engine, in its condition, it's a couple $1,000s in the U.S. market, classic car market. We'd call it a project car. Sometimes they call them barn finds because you find it in a barn. It's a couple grand, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 at most. What do you think that car, the red car in the background, it's going to get worse when I talk about the white car, but the red car in the background, what do you think that sells for in Cuba? Now, Cubans are very poor. Average income in Cuba is around $2,000 per person per year. So how much do you think that car costs on the private resale market? Not far off. It's about $15,000 to $18,000 for the classic American cars. Now that's 8 times average income. Average income in the United States is $50,000, so that's a $400,000 car in American terms. Wow, that's insane. Now the reason for this is simple. Why is that car so expensive? Is because of supply and demand. I mean, there are no cars in Cuba, and even though the Cubans are very poor, the supply of cars is almost zero. There's very few cars. So the prices just get bid up very high. But the other reason is he's a taxi. He doesn't say taxi, because if you put a sign that says taxi, that would be illegal, because who can have taxis? The government can only have taxis. But he's a taxi. He doesn't have to say he's a taxi. If you walk up to him, he's going to say, "You want to?" You know. So he's absolutely for hire. All right, and taxis are expensive. Why are they expensive? Again, few cars. Like it costs $50 to go just across the. I mean, it's brutally expensive. Everything else in the island is cheap, but the cars, because the cars are so, getting around was very expensive. So he's making a lot of money by being an owner of that car. He makes a lot of income, driving people like me, tourists around. And all of the value of that income gets capitalized into the price of that car. But there's no fundamental reason why a car like that should be $13,000, $15,000, $18,000. That is absolutely insane. You can buy a 20-year-old Toyota for $20,000, or for $10,000. You can buy one for $5,000. There's no reason that car should cost what a modern, like a used car would cost. It's going to get much worse because the car in the foreground is a 1991 French Renault. That was a piece of junk the very day it was built. This picture was 30 years old. After it was 30 years old, it's really a piece of junk now. That sells for about $30,000 in Cuba. So that's a Aston Martin in our world. Like relative to income levels, that Renault, like if you're the guy, the guy on it, man, you can see he's proud of it too. Like look at him, he's like, look at my car, right? Really, that guy, you know, he's like, this is mine, baby. You know, I get it, you know, because that's an Aston Martin in his world. If I had an Aston Martin, I'd be hanging out like I wouldn't touch it, I wouldn't want to scratch it, but like, look at my car, people. You know, so this is insane. Socialism messes up prices. Sometimes they mess up prices because the central planners don't know how to set prices, but sometimes it's just supply and demand gets so far out of whack with reality that prices go haywire, and this doesn't make any sense. So like you can get a lobster dinner for $1, but you couldn't get a taxi ride, you know, up 2 blocks for under 20. It just doesn't make any sense. Yes? They're fully aware. Yeah. Here's the thing, though. I talked to several Cubans, but I was very reluctant to engage. I didn't have my interpreter with me there either, so my Spanish is pretty poor. Like to talk to people. I was if I had asked somebody a question that was too probing or too intent, and they got overheard and got in trouble, I just couldn't live with myself. Like ruining someone's life is not worth one line in my stupid book. So I ended up not doing a lot of direct engagement with Cubans. I even had a phone number in my pocket of a Cuban dissident, an actual activist a friend of mine knew, and I had their phone number. I could have called them. I almost did, but I know their phone lines are bugged, and for them to meet with a professor of economics who's writing about capitalism and stuff, I was too reluctant to do that. So we didn't get a lot of man on the street stories, mostly our observations here. I did in other places, but not so much here. I wouldn't want to put them in harm's way. They're fully aware, though. There's enough back and forth between the Cuban American community and Cubans. They all know. They also get illegal. Now people bring down thumb drives with modern television shows and stuff. So there's a lot. There's also an underground internet market. A couple of the fancy hotels have Wi-Fi, and people will get an official Wi-Fi card from the hotel with a certain number of minutes on it, and then they'll resell it outside and so there's like a row of people with their phones right outside the wall of the hotel on the alley trying to get the signal. because that's really the only way to get the internet. Yeah.
Is there a difference between the socialism in Venezuela to the socialism in Cuba?
Yeah, it's definitely different. Every socialism carries its own sort of flavor to it. And I think it's fair to say that the Venezuelan socialism hasn't gone as far down the road. I mean, Cuba literally, government-run restaurants, government-run stores, government-run everything. Venezuela's only nationalized like the major firms. They haven't nationalized people's homes in Venezuela yet. People still have like titles to their homes and things. So Cuba really is further down the road. So there's definitely going to be flavors like that. Obviously, there's going to be economic differences too. But
to some degree, the Cuban socialism model seems a little less hellish than the other socialist models. There seems to be more food. I'm just curious to understand why it's semi-tolerable.
Yeah, so there's two things that have helped Cuba a lot. One is in the early days, it was Soviet money. The Soviet Union wanted to keep Cuba functioning well as a sort of a, middle finger to the U.S. And so there was huge Soviet subsidies. Of course, that ended abruptly in 1990, and right after the Soviet Union fell apart, the subsidies fell, and Cuba went through a very, very rough time in the early 90s, mid-90s. But then later on, it's tourism dollars. So the main way the government acquires foreign exchange that they use to buy imported food or imported items of any kind that they then supply to the government-run stores is by the tourism, which isn't American tourism, but there's just cruise ship after cruise ship that comes from Mexico, Canada. European cruises come sometimes. That's the main thing that kind of keeps it up. Like there isn't like a vibrant Venezuelan. Actually, I would rather go to Venezuela, but it's not like the tourist destination. They don't have great beaches to the same extent that Cuba does. It's close too. It's 90 miles away from the United States, so it's easy to get to. Yeah.
Just to the previous point, I know for a fact things at least 2 years ago were way worse than what you're describing.
Yeah.
COVID hit them really, really hard. I mean,
Yes. So very different today. COVID killed them because the Soviet money was gone, the tourist money disappeared, and right now, today, there are essentially they're starving. There are food riots. The power is out frequently. It's very, very bad right now. So yeah.
How do you go inside what was very American?
Yeah, good question. So the U.S. embargo is an embargo on goods trading, but they've always allowed a certain amount of travel. The rules have changed over time. But in the old days, the only way to do it was to do an official Cuban government tour. They had a friend, and it was just a complete propaganda job. I would never have done that because all they do is they take you to these really nice Potemkin villages, essentially. What we did, because we were professors, there's a line that says, you can go individually if you're going as a university professor for research purposes. And we're like, well, we're writing a book. So we just booked a flight. Now there are no commercial flights there. Now there are, but there weren't then. So we had to do a charter from Miami. The other way to do it is you fly to Mexico and then take a regular flight over.
I remember because I was in Miami and wanted to travel in Cuba and they said no, you must go out.
Yeah, so for a long time the only way to do it was to go out and come back in. That was technically illegal in the United States, but the Cubans didn't stamp your passport. Like I know Israel sometimes won't do, sometimes. So they didn't stamp your passport, so when you went home, they didn't know you went to Cuba. It's just, you went to Mexico as far as the government was concerned. We went right in the official way because we were professors, and by the time we did it, there was a thaw in relations with Obama was president, and now today I think it might be harder. Although a friend of mine is literally there right now, and he's there privately, so you can still do it. It's just hard. I don't want to talk too much about Korea because we didn't go into North Korea either because my wife said I couldn't get murdered, and that's not really an exaggeration. Just a few months before we went to Korean Peninsula, some American kid was murdered because he stupidly, one of these dumb Christians, he brought a Bible into North Korea. I mean, he shouldn't have had to die for that, but he ended up getting killed. he was arrested and he died. So again, I've said stuff, I don't want to be, So there were official ways to go in North Korea, but I didn't want to do it. It's also fake. All you do is the government stuff. I don't know, what's the point of that? But we went to, we did the same thing we did in Venezuela. We went to the northern border with China. The border between North and South Korea is the DMZ. You can barely see each other, and it's a tourist trap, so don't go there. It's not worth the bus ride. If you're in South Korea, don't go up to the DMZ. It's a complete waste of time. It's just like, oh, okay, there it is. And then you're like, is that it? That's it. There's a museum, but you can go to a museum about the Korean War in Seoul, and you don't have to go on a bus ride for 3 hours. So, but in the Chinese border, it looks like it's a river. It's a Yalu River. It's open. It's not mined. We took a cruise ship up and down, several miles each way. So it's a border. There are checks. There's bridges, and then you just can't walk across. But it looks like any other border. You've seen this photograph before, I'm sure, the space satellite photograph. That's not a Photoshop, because when and should mention, this is Dandong. So that white stuff, that's the city in China that we went to. It's a city of about 9 million people. You've never heard of it, because 9 million doesn't, nothing in China. That's a village, right? So, but it's a pretty impressive city of 9 million people. There's skyscrapers and everything. So you can see it lit up at night. But when we got to the city at night, we looked across the river, and it actually is dark over there. On the Dandong side, it's lit up like a Christmas tree of lights. All this just incredible skyscrapers and Coca-Cola and all those different signs for different companies. That's across the river, and that's the moon. That's not a light, that's the moon. So there's really very little. There's something like 800,000 people living on the North Korean side of that river, and at night it is absolute, utter, one or two little pinpricks here or there. It's really quite weird. It's medieval, literally medieval. Like, it's just very strange. So we talked about North Korea in the book. This is the chapter that I think is a bit more analytical. I want to tell, it's not a car story, it's a tractor story. We went up the Yalu. There was the terminus of the Wall of China comes there. Like the Great Wall of China ends in the sea, right there at Dandong. And like, oh, okay, so let's go get a photograph on top of the Great Wall. But it's right on the river, and there was this farm, and it had a tractor, and it was you could tell the tractor was very old, and you could hear it. It had that old diesel engine thump, that very low RPM, that old engine, diesel engines especially have that certain sound. You could hear it coming across the valley, and it was a pretty flat farm, and he was trying to get up this little rise, and I could see this poor farmer. By the way, most everyone was using horses and donkeys to plow, but he had a tractor, and it was trying to get up this little up slope, and you could just tell it was just, and it just kind of. And then I saw him just sort of sadly go back. And I felt so horrible for that guy. I mean, because the other choice is having a mule or a donkey or a horse, because that's what most of the other farming was. So when I say it's medieval, it's really, really, literally so. All right, let's talk about China. It's called fake socialism. How can you tell? Look at all the advertising, right? You get off the plane in Beijing or Shanghai, which is the two cities we went to, plus Dandong, and there's just, your eye is assaulted with ads for Western brands and brands you've never heard of. A very vibrant place. Of course, China gave up its socialism. They gave up its hard socialism. Like the hardest socialism ever was Mao's socialism during the Great Leap Forward in the 1960s. No country, maybe the brief period of what they called war communism in Russia, but Maoist China in the late 60s was as communist, as hard socialist as it got. Killed millions of people. Well, in 1978, they began this period of reforms after Mao's death. And, we talked about this the other night. It's not like a free market economy, but it's 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 in the same neighborhood as countries like India or whatever. It's just a normal kind of poorly functioning economy, but not bad. But what's happened, of course, is it's unleashed this prosperity, 10% growth rates for a generation. Hundreds of millions of Chinese people are now living in decent, dignified middle-class lives. They don't have to worry about where food and shelter is coming from for the most part and so forth. We all know that China is still a politically totalitarian regime, right? Not as politically totalitarian as you think. I heard plenty of Chinese people. We had friends who we met who live in China, full-time residents. They criticized the government like you or me. They told jokes about the leaders. They were just as outspoken and critical of their leaders as you and I would be here in our own countries. That's good news. But on the other hand, we spoke at a conference. It was a conference on Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek, which is a weird combination, but also how cool it is to be in Beijing, China, and being asked to talk about Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek. It was really neat. And we spoke, and the next morning, we were getting to the airport. A friend of ours called us, and she said, "Are you guys still there? If you aren't, don't go. The government has shut the conference down." So the very next morning after we spoke, I think it was something Ben said, they came in and they shut the conference down. They arrested the leaders of the conference, put them under house arrest. They padlocked the building. And that group, the group that organized that doesn't exist anymore. Their permit to operate was pulled. And this was when I really oh, okay, the honeymoon is over. The Chinese Communist Party is back really hard, reasserting its authority over political matters. So again, China's got this schizophrenia. They're trying to let their people have some degree of economic freedom. Those pictures on the right are the same basic photograph. That's Shanghai, the old Shanghai with the old colonial town. Looks like you're in Germany. And then that's Pudong. Pudong is the slum in the background of the bottom picture. Pudong was a swampy slum, and today it's the financial district of Shanghai. And so it's not fake socialism. It's not fake. It's really working. It's absolutely moved in the direction of capitalism. It's actually created lots of wealth and lots of prosperity for millions of people. It's a great thing. But the totalitarian political regime is doing its very best to hold on. It's a schizophrenia. Yeah. All right. I don't want to talk too much about Russia either. We did go to Moscow and Kiev. Kiev, about the same. This is unfortunate. I really wanted to get out more. Time was constrained. Capital cities always look great because a lot of capital cities, that's where they steal all the money, put the city, and it looks wonderful there, right? You got to get out to, when you see the victims of the theft, that's out in the villages. So, but Moscow is quite nice. How's the beer in Moscow? It was great. Well, we drank a lot of vodka too because when in Rome, but good beer, no problem. Buy, beer. How was the beer in Dandong, China, or Shanghai, or Beijing? It was great. I was buying Western beers. They had microbreweries. It's like, it's like, wow, it's like being home. I had North Korean beer. I did, because they have some smuggling on Chinese, so we bought some. It tastes like paint thinner. I don't know what it was bad. It was very bad. So, but in Russia, so when you go to Moscow today, you don't see, I saw a statue of Marx, but you don't see a lot of evidence visually on the street of the old socialism. We called it hungover socialism because Ben and I are hungover, but also it's hungover because they're still feeling the after effects, but it's not as visible. You have to look for it. But one of the observations we had was in Red Square, there was this big line. And if you've studied Soviet socialism at all, I know Israelis are lucky, or whatever the word is, you are privileged to have a lot of people here who grew up in Soviet Russia. I know they're getting older now, but you've got people, right? So you may have a much better understanding, but Americans have almost no idea what life was like, day-to-day existence. But if you know about Soviet times, waiting in line was just a constant battle. every day. There are surveys, time surveys. Soviets had all these scientists with nothing to do, so they did all these studies. There are Soviet studies that the average Soviet housewife would spend 40% on average of her waking hours waiting in lines. Right? If you saw a line forming, or if you were walking somewhere and you saw a line, you would get in the line and then ask the person, what are we waiting for? Because well, it had to be good. It's something worth waiting in line for, right? And oh my gosh, butter! I got butter this week. Maybe there'll be some, and hopefully they still have butter by the time you get to the front. So waiting in line was just this constant thing, and all of these rituals and a lot of like Soviet time culture even was built around the waiting in line thing. Bernie Sanders, you can tell I really like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders in 1986, I believe. So this is right at the end of the Soviet Union, but it was still the Soviet Union. Bernie Sanders went on his honeymoon to Russia. Yeah, he didn't marry my wife. My wife would not have let that happen. So he went to the Soviet Union for his honeymoon, and he came back and he went on, he had a lecture tour, and it's on YouTube. You can look it up. He has these talks where he's like, the waiting in line isn't that bad. It's community building. What? It's true though. I mean, a lot of like the gossip, like a lot of community happened there. You had to talk to the people in line. You're going to wait in line for 45 minutes. You're going to eventually something. So a lot of community did happen. But is that something you guys want in your life? Have to wait in line for 45 minutes to get butter? I'll just send an email to my neighbor if I want to, check in. Or I don't need to wait in line for that. So the point is, Bernie romanticized this thing that to actual Soviet citizens was a day-to-day, the most dreary aspect of their existence was having to wait in lines to get basic necessities. Well, there are no lines in Moscow today, except this one. This is the line to get in to see Lenin. At his body is on display in Red Square. They don't charge for it. So it's free, and when things are free, you tend to get shortages. So there's a line that forms, and I hope they never charge for Lenin's tomb. I hope it always is a line, because if you want to remember Lenin and the legacy that he gave, it should be by having to wait in line. We did it. We did it. And they have all these lectures. Be stern, no laughing, no Ben kind of tried to give him the finger, but the guard was onto him. So it's very serious. But that was in terms of telling a story about socialism, that line was great. I'm like, oh, this is going to work well in the book, because it's hard to tell people, unless you've done it, unless you've lived it, it's hard to convey how important that kind of thing was to them. So we'll wind towards a conclusion. This is Georgia. I can do a lot on Georgia. Let's try not to. When I started going to Georgia in 2005, and I went there once or twice a year until 2019. So it's somewhere between 15 and 19 times, 17, 16. I don't know, it's high teens. I've been there a lot. Been all over the country. I've done a lot of mountain climbing there, beautiful mountains, scary mountains. Some mountains are pretty and like serene and like soft, and then there are mountains, the South Caucasus, the mountains are not nice. They're looking at you like they want to kill you. Anyway, I love Georgia. Food and wine is great. And again, to continue the alcohol metaphors, you may know this, Georgians are very proud of the fact that they invented wine. Well, if you ask Georgian, they invented everything. Like, if it exists, the Georgians will tell you they invented it. But in the case of wine, they probably did. The archaeologists have found evidence of wine cultivation and winemaking in Georgia from 6000 BC, so 8,000 years ago. It's the oldest known wine making on Earth. And so they may dig up something here in Israel in a week and dethrone Georgia, but right now Georgia is the oldest, and it's not close. Like the next one is 2,000 years sooner. So they're a wine people. They're very proud of their wine. They have varieties of grapes that exist only in Georgia. Every village has a different grape than the next village. Some of the vines are hundreds of years old. Like the rootstock is like a tree trunk. So they're very proud of it. Well, the Soviet Union takes over Georgia in 1921. The Bolsheviks reinvaded Georgia after a brief independence. And they set up a central plan. So Moscow's going to decide what gets done in the new Soviet economy. Well, they're not morons in Moscow. They know Georgians make wine. So they sent down the orders, okay, make wine. They hired central planners to go down there, bureaucrats, to organize the wine industry in Georgia for the benefit of the people in the Soviet Union. If you were a Soviet citizen, you probably drank Georgian wine a lot. What did they do? They planted French grapes like Merlot, which is not a good grape in the first place, and they Cabernet, Chardonnays, whatever. They planted massive acreages of second-rate French grapes. They made it, and it was garbage, but that was the only garbage in town, so people in the Soviet Union drank Georgian wine. They were happy to do so because some bad wine is better than no wine. And so Georgians during Soviet times were making wine, but it was terrible. In 1991, when they declared independence, all of those state-owned firms were acquired by the Georgian government. The Georgian government quickly sold them all away. How many of them are still operating? None. They're all gone. Who wants to buy Georgian Cabernet? We talked yesterday, no one barely wants to buy our Israeli Cabernet. No one wants to buy Georgian Cabernet. So what's happened since then, though? Georgian grapes are coming back. They're very good. But it's their grapes. Saparave, the various local varietals that don't grow outside of their country. And he mentioned the orange wine yesterday. That's why I asked the question, because I knew he'd talk about they call it amber wine, and they don't like it when we call it orange wine, but everyone else outside of Georgia calls it orange, because it's almost like orange. It's not that orange, but it looks like an amber beer. Very dark color. So it's not like a clear, like white wine that we have. And it's because they're still using the old sort of, they call it a qvevri, but it's like an amphora, the clay pot. They still make their wine like that. And one of the ways they do that is you can get this very orangey color, amber color, white wine. And that's become very snobbish now. You're in New York City, you order a Georgian amber is like the fancy thing to do. So they're exporting it, and if people are wine tourists from all over the world are going there, it's become a huge export business for the country. The Soviets could have done that, but they're central planners. They're like the Cubans. They got two types of beer. We're going to make wine. Is it good wine? It doesn't matter. We're going to make wine. They made wine, but it wasn't very good. So anyway, we talked in the book a lot about the wine thing as a metaphor, again, for the transition of the economy from Soviet times to modern times. Stalin's, this is Georgian, so I went to his house, and there's a statue. I gave him the finger. I'm not a nice person. So, all right, last thing on this tour. We didn't know quite how to end the book. It was basically Bob and Ben and me, Bob and Ben. We wanted to go drink and travel and write it off, but we didn't know how to end the book. And so a friend of ours read a manuscript, and he says, well, you talk about Bernie Sanders and AOC and these surveys of the young people. So what you should do at the end of the book is can you find is there a socialism conference in America? Well, sure enough, like 3 weeks later, there was a socialism conference in Chicago. Every year they have it. We registered. The registration surprisingly, it wasn't free. I had to pay for it. And Ben, I signed up under my name, Southern Methodist University. I was not going to be that guy that secretly records people. If someone asked me who I was or why I was there, I told them I'm an economist from Southern Methodist University, and I study socialism. I didn't quite reveal that I don't like it, but I told them, I was pretty honest with them. It wasn't that gonzo journalism. I don't care for that duplicity. So I went as an academic. They call you comrade when you're there. Has anyone called you comrade? The first time it happens. Yeah, okay, yeah. No, this is unironically when you're called. The first time someone calls you comrade, it's weird. I mean, it's not I probably jumped a little bit. Okay, that's strange. So we went to this conference, It's the biggest socialism conference in America, primarily populated by people about your age and a few really aging hippies. And almost no one was our age. We were weird. That's why we stood out. It wasn't stood out because we dressed like more normal than they did, but it was also because they dressed because we were just not the right age. But here's the good news. The largest gathering of socialists at the biggest socialism conference in the United States, we found very few actual socialists. We found a lot of Bernie Sanders people. We found a lot of people who thought socialism meant Denmark, which it doesn't. I would occasionally ask, like, do you think the government should take over the 7-Elevens? And they were like, no. Okay, good, because that's kind of what socialism means, though. Just it means they take over the means of production, the stores, the factories, the farms. They didn't seem to be in favor of socialism in the textbook sense of the word. They were progressives, leftists. They had very often most of them seemed to have only like one or two causes. They were very passionate about one or two things. And many of the things that they were passionate about, I agreed with. I mean, I shared their, if not passion, I at least agreed with their interest. There were a lot of people talking about racist American cops. This was before George Floyd, but it was still when there was a period of increased interest in treatment of African Americans by police officers in the United States. I'm really concerned about that too. That's a topic that I think is really important. And there were, like, over and over again, there were issues like that. Like, that's a really, like, the environment. I think that's a really important issue. But something, I don't know how this works, but something has convinced these people that turning economic control, turning control of the economy over to a centralized state, they've been convinced, or they've convinced themselves, that that's going to fix racist cops. And I'm like, I don't think that tracks. I mean, it's not like the Soviet Union or Cuba or any other place that actually tried state socialism. It's not like any of those places had nice cops or good environments. Some of the most horrifically bad environmental outcomes have occurred under socialism and central planners. So I was like, so that was the problem. I left the conference 50% uplifted because they didn't like Mao, they didn't like Stalin, they didn't want to kill 20 million Ukrainians or whatever. I mean, they weren't evil. They were just like normal left-wing kids. Okay, cool. That was the 50% of uplifting part. The part that kind of brought me down was like, how do I convince them that socialism is a terrible solution to those problems, and that actually capitalism is probably it's not going to be nirvana. It's not going to fix every problem on earth, but it's going to do a better job at least on many of those things. I left completely clueless about how to reach them. And I know this book didn't do it, because you write a book called Socialism Sucks, they're not picking it up and reading it. But anyway, it was fun. There is one last beer story. In Illinois, just by coincidence, I think it's coincidence, the meeting's in Illinois. It's always in Chicago. There's a brewery. It's a private, it's not a microbrew, it's big now, but it's a private, standalone brewery. And it's called Revolution Brewery. And all of their are like raised fists, like, fight the power kind of things. And so there's that you can't really see it, but that green one is a green fist, and it's for anti-hero IPA, and it's got a red star on it. So Revolution Brewery has branded all of their beers, and they have a lot of good beers, around sort of socialist or solidarity, labor themes, sort of, and they have a red star. Now, partly the Illinois state flag has a red star on it, but it's a 6-pointed red star, not a 5. So it's a different shape of star. So they're using the Illinois star, but again, they're playing on the socialist themes to sell their beer. Well, the irony, of course, is it's a private company. I looked it up. It's an LLC. I don't know who their investors are. It's not even employee owned. I checked that too, because there are employee owned companies in America. Not very many, and they don't get very big. But it wasn't employee owned. It was a LLC, as a capitalist as you get. I thought that was ironic. The kids were drinking it like crazy because it's got their theme. But and it was great beer, a better beer than you can find in any socialist country. That's for sure. All right. So that's the book. And we did okay. We ended up number 5 on Amazon. We were on a big television show in the United States, and that shot us way up. If you're all old enough to read it, but we have F words in it. It's a rated R book. So it's not a book I would buy and give to my 12-year-old niece, unless your 12-year-old niece is more mature than most. So, but we had a lot of fun with it. And I want to kind of go back to where I started, though, at the very beginning, and then we'll have whatever time's left for Q&A. There are multiple ways to talk and to engage a message, and I am frankly more comfortable with the Economic Freedom Index, tariff rates, marginal tax rates, property rights, how many days does it take to start a business, all those data. I'm a data guy. I gravitate towards that. I tend to think, if you want to convince me of something, if you want to convince me of your position, I know that I am much more likely to be convinced if you bring to me data. I may not be convinced, your data may not be convincing, but I'm much more willing and open. But I've also noticed a lot of people aren't interested in data. They're not, maybe, I don't think they're not smart enough, but they don't engage that way. They need a narrative, they need a story. And socialism tells a good story. Socialists tell the story, if you join our group, you join our movement, we will solve racism and sexism, and we'll end inequality. And so this is a very seductive narrative, it's a very seductive message. The capitalist side shows up with charts and graphs. Now that works for me, but it doesn't work for most people. So part of the reason we wrote this book was to see if Ben and I had any capacity to do the narrative version of it. It's a different way of talking about things. Maybe the soap story and the broken bowl on the toilet seat, maybe that story will convince you if my chart and graph won't. So this is a little bit of a pivot for Ben and me. And it's really, though, the reaction to the book and the number of people that come up to me who have said, that book really changed my mind. Like, really? I'm surprised. It's convinced me that I need to integrate into my regular work more narrative, more storytelling. Because certain groups of people are not going to be, they're not going to get convinced by numbers, which is my first choice. So anyway, that was the sort of bigger picture for the book. I didn't mention P.J. O'Rourke. Has anybody read a book by P.J. O'Rourke? It's an old American writer. He's died a couple years ago. He was a comedic writer, and he was a free market guy, and he wrote these absolutely outlandish books, and we also padded our writing and our style after P.J. O'Rourke. And the proudest thing in my career is I played two proudest things. I played tennis with Milton Friedman, and P.J. O'Rourke wrote a blurb for our book. And those are the two things. I can't put those on my CV, but those are the most proud moments of my career. PJ is a great. If you ever see a PJ O'Rourke book in a used bookstore, buy it because he's hilarious. It's a wonderful writer. All right, thanks. That's a very good question. If you didn't hear, the question was about the policing and the problem with the African American, whether this. So here's the interesting fact. I don't know about Israel, but I'm pretty sure this is true in Israel. Most police officers are not state police officers. In the United States, private security officers, and I mean including gun-carrying private security officers, who have the ability to arrest you and detain you and whatever, more than half of them are privately employed by businesses, malls, factories. They have their own private security. My university has private security, and there also next to that is public security, the government police. Now, a lot of times the private security will collect someone and they'll hand them over, but the primary policing is done a lot by private sector security. So I think we don't really have a 0-1. The question isn't, do we have government police or private police? The question is, what's the sort of share there? What's the ratio? I can tell you that there's a big difference if a private security officer did what we see many public American police officers do. If a private security officer detained someone and killed them the way that cop did with George Floyd, that person would have immediately been fired. It would have been a trial. So I guess that cop did get in trouble but very often these cops skate because they got unions. The political system protects those police officers because they're government people just like they are. So I don't have a 0-1 view of this, but I think we do have a policing problem, and it's the same problem we have because it's a state. It's not quite a state monopoly, but it's almost a state monopoly in some areas. So in private residential neighborhoods, if you're poor, you don't have private security. Rich people do. They have private security in their rich neighborhoods, but not if you're poor. Your only police force that you can deal with is the state. They're heavily unionized. All the protections are on the cop side, very few protections on your side. And we get results that are frequently pretty bad for those communities. They're working on it. I'm skeptical. Those cameras are helping a lot. I'm pretty convinced that the data we get on this now is the police officers that have the body cameras, that citizen complaints are going down like crazy in the communities that added those earliest. The complaints went down. So I think that little bit of accountability has done a lot, which we didn't have before.
Can you give us your view of Scandinavian case, their fake socialism, and how it does work that they have central planning and high taxes and so.
Well, it's mostly capitalism, so it works. I think they would be better off if their taxes were a little lower. I think their labor market could be a little bit more liberal and they'd have but I'm not going to quibble. Personally, I'm more energized about Venezuela's, of the world, which is just ruining the lives of millions of Venezuelans. If the Swedish people, who are already pretty rich, grow at 2% instead of 3%, I think that's bad for them. I'd rather grow at 3% than 2%. But it's not something I get terribly excited about arguing about. So for me, right?
No, but for us,
so
we're trying to figure out
I know there's no question though that if the Northern European countries lowered taxes and had somewhat smaller governments, I believe their economies would grow more rapidly. They would attract more capital, more investment, and they would grow more quickly. And then over 20 years, they would be, their growth rates would it's going to be positive either way, but it'd be a little bit more positive. I believe that. I'll tell them if they ask. It's just that I only have 24 hours in a day. I don't want to, So I'm going to switch sides, so we'll go to something.
So, what's your position when it comes to the weaker forms of capitalism, let's say the American healthcare, and so
Well,
the capitalistic framework, what's your solution? If that's not
so the American healthcare system is a mess, but it's not a capitalist system in any way. I mean, it's, first of all, 50+%, over half of all dollars spent are spent by the government on healthcare for either old people or poor people. We have two large programs that finance everyone over the age 65 gets free government health care. Everyone below a certain income, and that income isn't that low, it's like 2 times the poverty level. So our poverty level, our internal poverty level is like, for a single person, it's like $15,000. So basically anyone under $30,000 gets free health care. Anyone over 65 gets free health care. And those two groups that's 50% of the dollars. The rest, it's all being done through insurance companies, and the only reason we do it with insurance companies is because the government lets us write that off our taxes. There's a real strong implicit subsidy for using insurance companies as opposed to like paying for, like we pay for our groceries with our own food. I don't use an insurance company to buy food. I use an insurance company to go to the doctor. The reason for that is that we have a subsidy that subsidizes that approach. So that's a mess. I still blame the government for that. So I don't really consider either of those, but it is a mess. I'm not going to defend the system. It's absolute ridiculous. There are all kinds of economists, I'm not really one of them, out there who have what I would consider to be more free market solutions that just no one wants to listen to. So, well, I think one thing is we need to get to a system where at least routine medical care, I mean, like you have a cold, you have the flu, you break an arm, like that's not, breaking your arm is like changing the oil in your car. You should just pay for it. But we have a system that is bureaucratized, that the most minor of medical expenses is handled through this incredibly cumbersome and expensive government or insurance bureaucracy. And like, you know, if I need to change the oil in my car, I just go pay a guy to change the oil in my car. If I want my arm put in a cast because I broke it, I should be able to have a system that pays for that. Now, maybe we have a system, there's medical savings accounts, there's all these ideas for how we would do that, but they haven't really taken off. I'll give you an example. I just had a piece of, doctor said, here's this drug, and it's very expensive though. It's like, I'm like, how? So he gives me a prescription. He says, you can do it or not. It might help, might not help, but either way, it's very expensive. So I'm probably thinking, I'm not going to do this. It's not sure it's going to help anyway. But I called the doctor, and I went to the doctor, and he said, yeah, or the doctor gave it to me. I went to the insurance company. I said, well, I went to the pharmacy. I said, how much will this be? And they're like, we don't know. Like, okay. You have to, the insurance company will tell you. So I called the insurance company. I said, well, how much is this? It's like, well, we're not sure. So how will you, well, I can wait. It wasn't like crazy. I'll wait a week. Can I wait a week? You tell me in a week? Or how long is it going to take? They're like, no, you have to buy it and then we'll tell you. That's insane, right? That's absolutely insane. But I blame the system that we have on the government's, which has incentivized us. It's essentially a 40 cent on the dollar subsidy to run everything through insurance. And once you get into this world of insurance, no one cares about cost or price or anything. Doctors don't care about it. The insurance company even doesn't really care because they're just going to cover it in premiums. It's weird. Yeah.
So I want to ask about the Uber's case. So I know, like in general, as you showed us, that they have much less goods and services than others, but don't you think that maybe, like, from your experience, the fact that the resources and goods and services are allocated more equally kind of make their lives better in some way, like make it more fair and less jealousy and stuff like that?
No, I'll be honest, no. And partly because I can tell you, every time there's a chance to get out, they get out. They take extreme desperate lengths. It's crazy. I don't. And I've read a lot about Cubans and Cuban life, been there, but there's still a lot of jealousies, because here's the thing, the stakes change, but if you get more favored with the government, you get a bigger house. And so then there's a jealousy. Oh, they got a bigger house. Or what's worse, if your neighbor has a bigger house than you have, if you can rat on them, oh, I heard them say a joke about Castro, and they may get kicked out of their house and given a smaller house, and you can get their house because you were the loyal. So there's actually a lot of weird distrust and anxiety. Yeah, they're all pretty equally poor, but that doesn't in practice, that is not very attractive. I'm pretty sure of that. So I think it's a hard no. Yeah, so go in front here.
You said in the beginning of the lecture that high taxes and welfare state policy does not equal socialism.
Yeah.
I think it was in the first slide or something. But as a PPE student, I see in many ways Israel as a social democracy state, because we have a strong social rights, and we were established by socialists.
Yeah.
So if you can elaborate on that and what you think.
That's what I said at the beginning. It's a continuum. it's a range, and Hong Kong is here, Venezuela is here, and Israel's like here. You're not Venezuela. I mean, you're not Congo or Venezuela, but you're also not here. So you are a social, what we call a social welfare state or whatever. It's got a lot of those elements. So there isn't a very bright line. I do know that somewhere down here, I don't know where the line is, but somewhere down there we start using the word socialist, and I think it's not a very bright, discrete line from capitalism to socialism. It's really a smooth range. You guys are, I think we have you about exactly right on the index, somewhere in that sort of 75th percentile, more free than most African countries, more free economy than, but not as free as, say U.S. and Canada and Denmark and stuff.
Did you get any comments from government representatives or officials from those countries after you published the book?
Yeah, I was worried. I mean, I have a valid 10-year visa for China. I'm not 100% sure if I got invited to go back, if I should. I'm pretty sure I can't. China, they got a lot of people that don't like them. If they kept everybody out, and they have a big bureaucracy, I'm pretty sure even my book is below their radar screen, but it's a risk. I've had that for the index. I get regular communications from governments complaining, usually, about the Economic Freedom Index. So that happens on a regular basis. Over time, several dozen countries have contacted me, ambassadors or people in the various agencies. I don't think anybody. We got a lot of feedback, but it was mostly people on the street. The book was written for normal people, and so I don't know how many of them even would have read such a book.
And I have another, maybe naive question. So socialism on its own, do you think socialism would have worked without corruption of the leaders? Because it seems to me that something that has to do, something that is common between all those states and countries maybe, is that maybe the leaders are very corrupt and they want to have all the resources from themselves, which is also, leaders in the capital world. But
no.
Is socialism itself?
I think it's the thing itself. And so it doesn't even work when nice people do it. And it doesn't even work when it's, there's two things you hear. One is a variant of what you just said. Socialism will work when we get better people or nicer people or whatever. Another version of it is, well, all of the examples I was giving were state socialism, and some of the modern socialists, the kids at the group, at that conference, they'll say, we want private socialism and like worker enterprises, kibbutzim, yeah. Well, kibbutzim is actually a great example. We don't talk about it in the book, and if I was writing another edition of this book, I would add a chapter on Israel's kibbutzim movement. But 95% of them are privatized. And the ones that are remainingly still kibbutz are they're basically homeowners associations. I mean, they're not as enterprises. Socialism actually fails even in the nicest of hands because it's the system itself. It's the incentives of it, but also this is a bigger answer. The price system. The nice thing about kibbutzim is at least they were embedded in a market economy. So they had decent price signals of like what things were worth. So if you have good price signals, you can judge like how should we make this, how should we farm or how should we make this product because you've got good prices guiding you. Real socialist economies don't even have that and they fall apart much more quickly because they can't rely on markets at all. Yeah, I think we're done. Yeah, sorry.